So I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, which is Jamie Robbins. So Jamie is a program manager at Buglife, and as part of his role, he leads on Buglife's Important Invertebrate Areas program. So mapping Britain's priority networks for nationally or internationally significant invertebrate populations and their habitats. So they aim to make complex information on invertebrates understandable, usable, and readily accessible with maps and profile documents to help improve decision making and conservation outcomes. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to today's speaker, Jamie Robbins. Jamie, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Ness. Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Jamie Robbins. I'm Programs Manager at Buglife, as Ness said. I'll talk to you today about our Important Invertebrate Areas work. So this is what I'm going to run through today. I'm basically going to introduce you all to our Important Invertebrate Areas concept, how we identified a Britain-wide network of IIAs, and kind of move more towards what we're doing now, which is fine-scale mapping and producing various outputs, both maps and profiles, and how we can use them to get better outcomes on the ground for invertebrates, as well as a quick look ahead to, well, we're doing IIAs in Britain. What does that mean, and what else can we do? So a key thing, I suppose, to talk about at the beginning is what on earth are important invertebrate areas? There's lots of places that we know are really important for invertebrates. They're often iconic landscapes where people flock to them for wildlife, but also invertebrate experts go to them because they know all the rare stuff lives there. These are places like Dartmoor, the Gower in Wales, Windsor Great Park, and the Cairngorms National Park. So these are iconic landscapes. Some of them they're all well known for their wildlife, and although there's lots of debate nowadays about how national parks and national landscapes could be managed better for wildlife, despite that, there are still places within all of those places that are absolutely some of the best places in the UK for wildlife. But there's a tendency for experts to go to the same places to see the same rare things. So there's this kind of possibility of reinforcing the importance of sites because people go to those locations to look for the rare things. So part of what we're trying to do with IIAs is follow the data and really work out where on earth those most important areas are. So the definition of an IA is quite straightforward. IIAs are nationally or internationally significant places for the conservation of invertebrates and the habitats on which they rely. And that's really important. It's not just a case of following dots of where there are records, but making sure that behind those areas supporting records are the right networks of habitats to sustain those populations. And crucially, what we're trying to do with IIAs is try to get to direct that conservation effort for where it can most benefit invertebrate populations. There's some outstanding conservation work going on all across the UK. Sometimes with positive outcomes for invertebrates, sometimes with invertebrates a bit of an afterthought. So what we're trying to do is give people the tools to make better decisions for invertebrates. So that brings us on to this slide, the why do we need IIAs? If you talk to a lot of land managers, they know only too well the breeding birds they have on their sites, the mammals and the reptiles and amphibians they have on their sites, often the flowering plants. Often when it comes to invertebrates, it's a case of only knowing about the biggest, shiny, high-profile things, the butterflies, the bumblebees, the dragonflies. So what we're trying to do with IIAs is give invertebrates a level footing across the board. So like I said, it's trying to get something to help direct and focus all the effort going into invertebrate conservation work. Beyond that, we like to try and influence the development of future protected area networks. I'll talk about this later in the presentation, but we've got our network of sites of special scientific interest and other designations across the UK. And there's a question of how well do they actually serve the needs of invertebrates and how well represented are invertebrates within them. A crucial role of IIAs is also to play that role of raising the profile of invertebrates. A lot of nature conservation decisions are based on more charismatic groups, even within invertebrates. As I said, there are more charismatic groups within them. So it's trying to help decision makers and key stakeholders understand the importance and scale of the invertebrates that they've got on their hands. And where we are identifying IIAs, we want to give advice so that those areas can be better managed and protected for their invertebrate interest. One of my other roles at Buglife is I lead on our planning casework and our planning policy work. So with that hat on, I'm very keen to try and make sure that IIAs have a role in making sure there's better planning and development outcomes for invertebrates, something that's obviously quite topical at the moment. And of course, with everything involving conservation, there's always a desire to try and direct money to where it's needed the most. In terms of an eventual outcome for IIAs, or outputs, sorry, what we really want is we want freely available resources that can help everyone know where there are IIAs near them, what the underlying invertebrate interest is within them, and how to manage the threats and nurture through the opportunities to lead to more sustainable populations of invertebrates. To do this, from the very, very beginning of the process, it was agreed that it had to be based on sound, verified invertebrate data. If you talk to a lot of entomologists about the best places for invertebrates, a lot of them would reel off the same list of sites you'd expect, the Brecks, the New Forest, the Cairngorms, as all the ones I ran through before. And it's really important that we try and push that expert opinion aside, because although expert opinion has a really important role within invertebrate conservation, an exercise like this has to be based on data. We always said you can't have IIAs without invertebrates. And we wanted this methodology to be repeatable, and so that we could revisit it down the line with new data, new status reviews, and keep it as a live thing, not just an IIA snapshot in time that in 20 years is largely irrelevant. And the aim of all of this is to make those eventual outputs useful to everyone, whether it's planners, ecologists, land managers, local authorities, anyone who can influence outcomes for invertebrates. We want them to have this information that's a simple synthesis of all the complex invertebrate information. It won't do everything, but it will help hopefully mean that the key decision makers don't have to try and decipher incredibly complex invertebrate information, and can lead to better outcomes. So identifying that IIA network. So we've been working on IIAs now for around about 8 years or so, and it's been a long journey to get to where we are. So I've sort of laid out here the timeline and where we're going towards. And you can see the very clear spelling mistake on the top there, where it says expiry group consultation, which is meant to say expert group consultation. At the very beginning of the project, we had an expert group that consisted of people from the statutory bodies, so Natural Resources Wales, then SNH, Natural England, as well as people from biological recording and data backgrounds, help guide this process so that it was based on sound selection criteria and processes. We wanted to use the expertise in the country, not just in invertebrates, but in data and analysis as well. So at the very beginning, they tried to have a discussion about what should an IIA look like? Should it be based purely on number of species? Should it be based on our endemic species? Should it be based on British status reviews, European statuses, all these sorts of things to try and work out what a map network would look like. So they had a few goes at tinkering around with different data sets and different approaches to mapping before we stopped on the final one I'll run you through shortly. And very simply, what we settled on was identifying a network of 10 by 10k squares, or hectares, across the UK, across GB, I should say, that exceed our threshold for being IIAs. So we identified a Great Britain-wide network of priority hectares. And where we're at now is we're going through the process of looking at those grouped hectares and trying to fine scale map them, which I'll go into in detail shortly, to try and work out where the real site level detail is for them. And now we're looking at those maps and trying to produce the resources that help key stakeholders know what the maps mean. Maps are brilliant. We all love maps, but you need to make sure you've got the resources alongside it to help people understand it. So I said that at the very beginning, the idea was for our IIAs to be based on sound verified data. So we're lucky enough in the UK to have some absolutely incredible recorders and recording schemes. If you look at things like NBN, for certain species of invertebrate, there are hundreds of thousands of records, which is absolutely baffling to some of my European colleagues when I've spoken to them. But we made the decision at the beginning that we had to go with the most verified data of all. So we stuck with the data from around 80 national invertebrate recording schemes. If we'd, for example, just taken the data off NBN, that would have been very problematic based on a lot of records there being misidentifications or lack of verification. Similarly, we could have gone to all of the wonderful local environmental record centres that we have, but one of the problems we'd have had there is not just the cost of securing all that data, but again, there tends to be differing degrees of verification. So we worked with these 80 invertebrate recording schemes, and they're 50 million records, so there's a lot of data behind them. And this is everything from the parasitic wasp recording scheme, the spider recording scheme, the leaf mining moth recording scheme, all sorts of different species of different invertebrate groups. So we had our data set, and eventually working with the expert group, we arrived at some criteria for how all of those hectads, those 10 by 10k squares, could qualify as important invertebrate areas. Any hectare in GB, and I should add this is all done at the Great Britain level, so excluding Northern Ireland, on the basis that the red listing, the threat statuses for invertebrates are done on a Great Britain level. Those Northern Irish statuses are done at an all, together with the Republic of Ireland on an all-island basis. So any hectare in GB can qualify as an IA based through two routes. Essentially, it has to have a single record of a post-1990, that being our data cutoff for the whole project, post-1990 records of one of our rarest or most threatened species. So these are things which are either critically endangered or vulnerable globally on an IUCN red list, or at the European level are either critically endangered or endangered, or in our own national GB red list, critically endangered. There's a fourth category as well, which is those species that are endemic. There's around 20 recognized endemic invertebrates. Frustratingly, 2 of them are now thought to be globally extinct, but 9 of them are threatened. So we're including species that are endemic, but not widely distributed. And I caveat the widely distributed because there's a couple of species of endemics that, although only found in the UK, are actually quite widespread and would have skewed the map. So any of those criteria those jewel in the crown type species, a single post-1990 record, and a hectare will qualify as an IIA. The second way that a hectare can qualify is for exceeding a threshold for a number of species with a slightly lower level of threat or rarity. Those species are either European vulnerable or listed on the various directives, or endangered on a national red list, or simply nationally rare. And there's quite a lot of invertebrates that are nationally rare but don't have a threat status in that they're quite naturally quite rare within the landscape. But what we're essentially doing with those criteria, B1s, is having a criteria that an assemblage of invertebrates can qualify. And of course, some hectares will both have a nationally important assemblage and have one as jewel in the crown species as well. So they can qualify on both counts. So using those criteria across all of Great Britain, we produced this map. There will be more maps, I warn you. So what we're showing here is it's interesting to a degree in that we're showing the best parts of GB for invertebrates. There's interesting areas of discussion. Some of it's what you'd expect. You can see there's a typically coastal chain of IIAs, particularly on the south coast and the east coast. Inland, you see it's picking up some key areas of habitats like the fens, the brecks, Snowdonia. Up in Scotland, you've got the Cairngorms around Strathspey, and what we're kind of seeing is it following specifically rare habitats or distributions of quite thermophilic species on the northern limits of their range. It's really important to say that we always make sure that people know that just because somewhere's outside of the IIAs doesn't mean it is not important for invertebrates. There's a big Midland-shaped hole there, north of England and the Scottish borders and Dumfries and Galloway. There's big areas there where we don't have IIAs. So there is, of course, always going to be a question about whether this comes down to recording effort. But it is interesting, actually, anecdotally, to look at the Midlands, I find, because I know a lot of really prolific invertebrate recorders in the Midlands who have been recording for years and years, submitted thousands and thousands of records. Yet still, the Midlands is a big empty space for a lot of our important invertebrate areas. And it's not because of lack of records. It may just be that they lack the species that are thermophilic at that northern limit of their range, and also lacks some of the specialist habitats that they might be associated with. But this is an interesting map. You know, it shows some things, but this is really only the beginning. The next step after this is to dig down into those hectads and those broad scale IAs to find using local data and expertise to really find out where the areas are for invertebrates of importance. So we've got a GB-wide broad-scale map. We then had to lump those hectares together into kind of loosely recognisable IIAs, of which there's 101 in Great Britain. 66 of those are in England, and they range massively in size. Some of them are single hectare ones like Lundy Island, or in Wales we've got the Great Orme headland, through to the South Downs, which is a whopping 31 hectares. So massive differences in scale there. And of those 101, 70 of them have now been fine scale mapped. So it's taken a long time to get here, but we've made really good progress. And at the moment, we're in the process of digitizing the New Forest IIA, which would be a really positive step. And all of those fine scale maps are now available through a GIS data hub. For the GIS folk amongst you, we've got it as a WFS, so that every time it's updated with a new fine scale map, it will update across systems. I'm just going to show you through that fine scale mapping to help you understand how we went from that big hectad map to the more detailed maps like that one there. In terms of why we're doing this, I hope it's fairly obvious, but the big blocky hectare map I showed you, it's interesting to show where the most important areas are for invertebrates. It doesn't necessarily help focus any effort or any prioritization work for invertebrates in general. To do that, you really need to tease out that site level interest. And this is where we move away from being entirely data led, as that broad scale selection was with the data from 80 recording schemes, through to a bit more local interpretation and expertise. So we bring in additional data from those local environmental record centres, as well as from other recorders in the area that are choosing to engage with the process. And we get all that data, and we very simply work with them to try and tease out where the good data is, what's verified data, what sites are still supporting them. So I'm going to run you through a few slides that show you what we did with the Thames Estuary South, which is a big sprawling IA on the North Kent coast, with, I think, near enough 200 species of our what we term IA qualifying species. So the map you can see there was shared as part of an online mapping workshop. All those dots you can see, you're not expected to be able to see the detail too much, don't worry. All those dots represent qualifying species. Well, and actually they tend to represent stacks of different records. So it can be multiple species with hundreds of records in. But so effectively this map has thousands of rare invertebrate records on it. And we present these maps together with useful polygons to help people understand the landscape. So things like the yellows there are the triple SIs, the pinky purples are the local nature reserves, and the blue ones are RSPB reserves. And we try and do this with forestry layers, with county wildlife sites where that data is available. And essentially working with an online group of experts, we go through that using our GIS officer to tell us what all those dots mean. And we collectively, through an online whiteboard, draw around where we think the IA areas should be. As part of this discussion as well, we talk about the species that we may have records for in these areas, and the experts may point out that was a species that's now extinct in the area. It might not have been seen since, so presumed that it may be that management is inappropriate for the species there. A site may have been lost to development in somewhere like the Thames Estuary. But there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of note taking about how the species list should evolve. But eventually, we come up with a digitized map at the end of a few weeks of consultation. So our GIS officer will digitize these scrawled on polygons for IA areas, and then with the back and forth with various experts, we then refine that down. So I wanted to show you a few other examples of these fine scale maps and how they came to be, just to kind of explain the approaches we take and what the network means overall. So moving over to Wales, we've got the South Wales Coast IA, which is another one of those big IAs. This one has, off the top of my head, it's over 100 IA qualifying species. But what I think is really interesting is to not bother about the species too much here, but to look at the different habitats that get lumped together within these IAs and support these invertebrate assemblages. So on the far right of that map, you'll see you've got the westernmost compartment of the Gwent Levels triple SI there. Obviously a site nationally important ditch fauna associated with it. Following the coast round, you start to go through a network of triple SIs and coastal habitat mosaics once you've hopped over the urban areas and the urban rivers sprawling out into the countryside. But if you look at the west side of that South Wales Coast IA, the polygon that goes kind of north-south, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but this bit there, all of that is the old steelwork. So it's brownfield habitat with a nationally important invertebrate assemblages found on them. So these are going to be areas which are prime development land, have no statutory protection for wildlife, and it's just an interesting combination, because if you look inland, I'm not sure again if you can see the pointer, the cursor, but there's just north of the Gay Road there, inland, there's a cluster of habitats. Those are all local wildlife site grasslands supporting important butterfly populations. So you've got this assortment of different habitats and interests that meld together into this IEA. I kind of wanted to quickly show you one that's at the complete other end of the scale here, really. It's the Fens IEA. Those of you that have been around the Fens will recognise it as an incredibly intensively managed arable landscape. There's still real gems of sites left in that remnant fen habitat as little islands of habitat. And this map probably would have reflected exactly what people thought would come out of an IIA map. Because with that intensively managed landscape, what you tend to have left for invertebrates and where the records supporting the rarest species are, is that remnant chain of triple SIs, a small number of wetland sites following river corridors, and local wildlife sites. Outside of this, the only species of conservation concern we were generally picking up were those that are quite mobile and able to adapt to changing ditch conditions across a landscape. I did mention as well that some of those IIAs are in here specifically for individual species of greatest concern. So this is one up on the Sefton coast in the northwest. So this is the Ainsdale Sand Dunes IIA, which is in purely for its population of the critically endangered dung beetle Amesius brevis, which was thought extinct until it was rediscovered on the site. So obviously for doing something with a single species, we didn't feel the need to run a big multi-person workshop. We were able to work with the taxon group experts and identify the areas of grazed habitat supporting the grazing animals and rabbits that the beetle relies on. And essentially, it's working around the National Nature Reserve and triple SI boundaries. There is a freshwater element to some of the IIAs we're doing. So this is an IIA in the northwest of England again at the Ian Valley that's as the best English population for freshwater pearl mussel. I think now the UK, I think they talked about the UK having 50% of the global population of freshwater pearl mussel. So it's really important that we're starting to recognise and do what we can for these populations. Obviously, the Scottish populations, for those of you that follow pearl mussels, are doing much better than the English ones. But for this one, what we did was we buffered the SAC boundary for the Ian Valley, as well as its source up at Ennerdale Water and the surrounding fells. Because obviously, when it comes to dealing with freshwater species, you need to consider a slightly more catchment-wide approach. So that's great. We've got maps. I showed you a few there, the South Wales coast, the fens, the Thames estuary. It's wonderful having maps. We don't want them to just end up being another map in a GIS layer or a map on a shelf. So we're producing outputs that will hopefully help people be able to interpret those maps. So for all of the IIAs that we're fine-scale mapping, eventually all 101, we're producing these dedicated profile documents for each one. So you can see some examples of sheets there from the South Devon coast one. And what these do, they range in size. I think the shortest one is probably 3 sides for one of our single species IIA. The longest, I think, is about 17 or 18 pages. So they can be quite detailed. But we're trying to make these the key resource for decision makers. So these will be things that outline the character of the landscape, the habitats supporting invertebrates, the reasons for selection in terms of identifying the key invertebrate species of conservation concern, but also not just species, also looking at invertebrate assemblages. For those of you that deal with terrestrial invertebrates, a lot of the time it's easier to think of things in terms of assemblages rather than individual species, purely based on the difficulty in identifying invertebrate species and understanding how they all piece together. And we're also picking up the threats and opportunities. So I'll show them in a moment again. But we've got 46 of those profiles now completed and live, with 6 of them underway, hopefully out by the end of June. And in those documents, it's really important that I highlight we're not trying to replace the really vital role of record centre data searchers. In planning, in recent local nature recovery strategies, they've got a phenomenal use. We're definitely never trying to replace them. We're trying to add something supplemental that can help people understand invertebrates without being able to, who can't, for example, process the thousands upon thousands of records they'll get with a data search. So we're trying to highlight those species that I said meet our IIA criteria, but we don't share the records. That's a really important outcome of this. We say, these are the species in that IIA, and here are the habitats they're associated with. So a key part of this is using the Pantheon tool, which I hope some of you will have heard of. It's an online tool developed by Natural England to take complex invertebrate data and tease out the associations and conservation status of the assemblages there, specifically with triple SI condition assessments in mind, but we find them useful for all sorts of different areas. But what these do is they pull out not just the habitats, but the really specific associations. So if you're a land manager and you might know you've got a site with short sward and bare ground, a nice short grassing with loads of bare areas that invertebrates love, This provides a detail for each of those species about the specific association. It might be the litter and ground layer. It might be that they want exposed sands and bare ground, or it could be that they're associated with the dung of grazing animals on a site. So we're identifying the specific habitats and the list of species associated with them, which if you're a land manager, you might just think of things in broad habitat terms. What this is doing is trying to identify the specific features within those habitats that invertebrates rely on. And similarly, I mentioned those threats and opportunities. So likewise, for key habitats that we've identified in each IIA, we're trying to give the best quality advice we can for how to manage for invertebrates within them. Broadly, we use quite generic guidance. We try to keep the example on the side there is sand dunes, again from the Norfolk Coast IIA. We try to make it so that they're as consistent across different IIAs as possible, but we absolutely recognise that sometimes there's a need to locally tailor them, whether it's because there's a more locally relevant invasive species or threat issue or approach to managing. So they're quite generic, those threats and opportunities, but we work with the local experts who do the mapping with us to then shape those eventual profiles so that experts on the ground also think these are the correct threats and opportunities for the invertebrates in the area. I keep saying about making this accessible. So this is a key thing that I'm working on this year, because we were working on those maps and profiles for a number of years, but having to keep fairly low key with them, because you only get one chance at kind of launching an idea, and I didn't want to push the IIAs too fast when we didn't have the maps and the profiles behind them to help them get used. So it's only now that I'm starting to go out and really promote them. But we've now got all of our IIA maps and profiles and resources on our website here. It's got an interactive map where you can zoom in, like here on the Black Mountains and Golden Valley IIA that straddles England and Wales. Literally, you zoom in, you click on it, you can get your profile, your maps. We've also, because we don't expect everyone to want to navigate maps, we've got a list of all of those IIA profiles on that website now, so that people can just download the PDFs. And as I said, we've got it available on this lovely GIS data hub, and you can see there some of the fine scale maps imposed on the GB map there. Some of them are so small that you won't see them at that level, of course. So this is great. We've got maps, we've got profiles. How's that going to make better outcomes for invertebrates? So as I said at the very beginning of this talk, a lot of it's about helping people to know where to direct resources. And a key outcome for me, again, putting on that I work in planning hat, is I want to see these used in local record centre data searches. A few of them are now, which is brilliant. And I've got a job on my hands for regions where we've now done all their profiles. I need to get in contact with those record centres and give them supporting materials they need to include them in their data searches. And that's crucial to make sure that, we keep hearing at the moment in the national policy landscape that there's an awful lot of pressure for house building, for development, for industry. And we need to make sure that where these decisions are being made, they know about the important invertebrate areas from the very beginning. So that's where getting them involved with data searches has a key role. With my planning hat on again, there's been so many times where a planning application has been submitted and it's so far down the master planning route, they know exactly where they're going to build and what they're going to build and where, the layout, everything. But they haven't considered invertebrates until we've hyped up at the end, and then it delays everything. They have to go and do their invertebrate surveys. It doesn't suit the developers, the local authorities, the ecologists, or us. So it's getting everything up front, hopefully. And crucially, it can help non-experts understand the areas of importance for invertebrates within the landscape. Away from the planning side of things, we're looking at local nature recovery strategies at the moment. We've been trying to engage with them. I'll touch on them briefly coming up. And more than that, it's just helping anyone who's working on green space networks or ecological networks understand how and where invertebrates can and should be considered. And as I said, there's a job here in protected area networks. So I know that the SSI network has remained rather unchanged in recent years. There's been a handful of SSIs that have been added to the network. So that it looks like other approaches are going to be taken to helping us reach our 30 by 30 commitments. But it's really interesting within SSIs in that there's a lot of key invertebrate sites that are not part of SSIs that are vulnerable to loss from mismanagement or development, any number of risks. But amazingly, even then, some of the best SSIs for invertebrates don't actually have invertebrates within their SSI citations. So it's more through, sometimes it may just be a quirk of luck or management. It may be that sometimes, of course, there's fantastic land managers that know how to manage the diverse wildlife on their site. But there's a risk that SSIs with important invertebrate features and habitats may be not being managed properly because they're not as a cited feature. So there is an exercise to be done in reviewing existing SSI citations and making sure that the network currently covers the best invertebrate sites. And in terms of local nature recovery strategies, there's two parts of the LNRSs that I think IIAs could play a crucial role. One is identifying the habitats of local importance, including ones that support scarce or declining species. And the other is the species or groups of species, the species or groups of species for which the strategy area is or could feasibly be of national importance. So what we're doing here is we've looked across Britain and got that network of sites to show these are the best sites, following the data blindly for invertebrates. And similarly, there's a role for IIAs to play within local wildlife site selection as well. I know down in Kent and Medway, they've now got IIAs as a part of their local wildlife site selection criteria, just as an example. So I should say at the beginning that we have actually finished the IIA mapping for all of Wales. Wales is slightly ahead of the curve. So we've got that full network done and initial profiles done for all of them, although we're currently already reviewing them. It's really interesting looking at those IIA maps for Wales and the different coverage with SSI protection. There could be reasons behind this. That the best protected is the Great Orme Peninsula, which I mentioned is just that early on is a very small hectare in North Wales near Anglesey, but 96% of that is within a SSI. And you compare that with the Montgomeryshire IIA at the very bottom of the list with just 8% of its habitat within a SSI. And just joint second from bottom, you'll see you've got the South Wales valleys and the South Wales coasts. So we looked at the South Wales coast earlier. I suppose it's interesting because I was mentioning there that there's parts of it part of the Gwent levels, but there's parts of it that are big unprotected brownfields or big areas that are just county wildlife sites, and that leaves them fundamentally, vulnerable to mismanagement, development, and ultimately being lost as important invertebrate habitats. So there's an exercise for Buglife to do, together with the statutory bodies, in looking at the SSI coverage within these different IIAs. And of course, there's, we keep talking about nature recovery nowadays having to be delivered by everyone, whether it's, infrastructure, development, business, agriculture. So we want to try and get IIAs out there in a more multi-sectoral fashion as well. So I'm trying to get these IIAs out at the moment to all sorts of different spatial mapping platforms. I've been giving presentations to ecological consultants. I want it to be part of some of the agri-environment scheme apps and planning tools they have for working out where they should be, what priorities they should be going for. I've also given a similar talk to all of the National Trust's conservation advisors. So there's a role here for local wildlife trusts and national trusts who, although often they'll know about their butterfly and dragonfly populations, they may not understand these less charismatic invertebrates and what to do for them. So I'm hopeful that IIAs can help to fill some of that gap. And crucially, again, moving on to the planning policy side of things, there's a lot of drive at the moment for biodiversity net gain. Could landscapes be improved or buffered around IIAs as part of that as well? And just to quickly show you these, that we are doing what we can. Buglife is an organisation of only about 50 to 60 people. We're not an enormous organisation. We're impactful, but we're not enormous. So we've been producing generic resources to help inform local nature recovery strategies and how they could consider invertebrates. That's including specific habitat types and also the actual IIAs that we've mapped out. And we're hoping to produce similar resources this year for nature networks up in Scotland as well. And don't worry, I'm nearly at the end of my slides. The one thing I did want to say is that it's all well and good that I've been focusing on invertebrates, this very focused taxonomic group. But it's been really interesting actually looking at some of our outputs and comparing them with plant life's important plant areas. So on the left there, you'll see the IPAs. On the right, you'll see our IIAs around the Brecks and the edge of the fens. And there's an awful lot of overlap there between the two. And I know there's been lots of talk with agencies in the last few years about trying to do things in a cross-taxonomic fashion. Some things work, some things don't. But it'd be very interesting to try and work out how these IIAs and IPAs would overlap more at the national level. And going back to Wales again, I did say we did that map, so in terms of how we're getting the information out there. We did do an actual Important Invertebrate Areas report in English and a Welsh version, launched at the Senedd at end of 2023. And it meant I got to have a fun looking IIA map in Welsh as well. There we go. Last couple of slides now in terms of the next steps for IIAs. Obviously, we really want to finalise this fine scale mapping of the IIAs and profiles for GB. It's been a very long slog, but we've been trying to get something off the ground that hadn't been done before, and it takes a long time to chip away at it. Frustratingly, when we get to the end of that, hopefully in the next couple of years, we're then going to go right back to the beginning, where we'll do this methodology again with updated status reviews, hopefully, and more data. I didn't spend too much dwelling on the status reviews, but there are some invertebrate groups that completely lack status reviews at the moment, and it's made it fundamentally difficult for this. So we had to rely on expert opinion and data-led selection of species approved by experts to include groups such as the Hymenoptera, for example. So the bees, wasps, and ants still don't have a modern red listing to help this process. So we had to rely on some expert opinion to feed into that. So I'm hopeful by the time we get around to rerunning this, we'll have a new suite of status reviews. But I'm also hopeful that the whole process should be quicker, because a lot of it should involve just tweaks to the existing maps and profiles. So although still a big undertaking, it should be a lot quicker than the 7 or 8 years it's taken us to fine scale mapping to get to where we are now. Last bit here. This is brilliant. We've been doing IIAs in GB. It's fantastic. We are, however, looking at how that methodology can be applied in other contexts. So at the moment, we have a Darwin Plus funded Supporting Atlantic Territories Invertebrate Conservation Project, which is a mouthful, which is piloting IA mapping in Anguilla, Ascension, Bermuda, and the Falkland Islands to see how applicable the criteria can be in overseas territories. Of course, it's a bit different when you're having to deal with massive swathes of endemic species, but it's an interesting challenge, and we're currently at the point where we're just identifying the areas for Ascension Islands, so that'll be the first non-GB IA map. And we're also working with a number of international partners who are looking at learning from our IA methodology in a number of countries for their own similar mapping exercises. I believe that is me. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me prattle on at you for half an hour.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jamie, for a really interesting talk. So we've had a few questions come in through the Slido whilst you've been speaking. So we'll just take a little bit of time to go through those now. Just a reminder to anyone still on the call, if you haven't submitted a question yet and you'd like to, the Slido link is still open and accessible through the chat, and you can post those anonymously. So I'll start with the first question. This is actually a really lovely one. Oh, it moved. What are some of the non-charismatic invertebrates which you think need a little bit of love?
You know what? They're one of our endemic species, and we make a big deal out of some wildlife. We don't. I'm going to say things like the Manx shearwater flea and Turk's earth centipede. So those are two endemic invertebrates. The Manx shearwater flea is only known from Rum in the whole world, and then we've got Turk's earth centipede that's only known from Scilly. I think there was a record on the Isle of Wight from a now built-over car parked area. And similarly, it was on our opening slide, we've got the horrid groundweaver down in Plymouth, a species that I worked with Ness when she was at Buglife, that's only known in the entire world from 3 quarries in Plymouth. And it's 3 limestone quarries, and it goes to show how vulnerable it is, because none of these sites are sites of special scientific interest. So it's an endemic species, but in theory, it's entirely vulnerable to development. So those are the kind of things that need shouting about.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll move on to the next question.
But it's not as friendly and cuddly as that last question.
Probably not. So, have you considered assessing which IIAs also meet the IUCN Key Biodiversity Area Site Identification criteria?
I
can repeat that as well if
no, that's absolutely fine. So there's an exercise that Buglife needs to do in looking at how IIAs overlap with KBAs. KBAs are really difficult to apply to invertebrates, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people at other organisations in the last few years. If you look at the KBI criteria, a lot of it is based around having proportions of global populations or breeding pairs or areas of occupancy. And that's really difficult for invertebrates. I've never come across a situation where invertebrates where they're talking about numbers of individuals. It's always about populations or numbers of sites because of the different ecologies. But on top of that, it's even harder because there's very few international red lists for invertebrates. So it's really hard to understand how like, for example, there's a few things there. Firstly, there's species that are critically endangered in the UK, so should be our priorities for conservation. But they're actually a lot more common in mainland Europe and globally. So there starts to be some clear discrepancies between our priorities and those that underpin KBAs. But on top of that, yeah, there's huge swathes of invertebrates that haven't gone through that red listing. And a species that strikes me as being difficult would be the royal splinter cranefly, which is only ever been found at Windsor Great Park and a single site in Slovakia. We have no idea about its occupancy. It's never been red listed. I mean, it's really hard to work out how we could apply KBAs to to invertebrates, let alone invertebrates in the UK as well. It feels like if you were to do it, a handful of KBAs would be identified in the UK, and they'd almost all be for our 9 invertebrates that are endemic and have a threat status. So you'd end up with some really odd ones, like I said, rum for that Manx shearwater flea, 3 limestone quarries in Plymouth that would be KBAs, but not even triple SIs, so not recognised in the UK as being important, but a key biodiversity area internationally. And then you'd have a few odd other species where we've got an important global population, like I mentioned, freshwater pearl mussel. So you'd end up with a really odd, disparate spread of very small, discrete sites, because almost all of those critically endangered or endangered endemic species are really locally recorded. Like some of them only ever have 1 or 2 records. It'd be historically, it'd be very hard to map them out. But it's interesting, with our IIA work, we do include the European, if casting your brains back to the selection criteria, we include European species that are vulnerable and endangered, critically endangered, away from the freshwater things like freshwater pearl mussels. I don't think there's any terrestrial invertebrate with a European status higher than vulnerable in the UK, with a global status higher than vulnerable in the UK, sorry. We don't tend to have the rarest stuff. So the problem you'd have is marrying up British conservation priorities with KBAs. It's very difficult to marry the two. There is an exercise I want to do in mapping out KBAs based on the data we've had, but there'd be an awful lot of finger in the air guesswork, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. That was really thought-provoking. So moving on to the next question, someone has asked, how can local communities get involved in monitoring or protecting their nearby IA?
It's the same. Well, whenever you talk about invertebrates and monitoring, it's always really difficult, because the challenge with invertebrates is that they're blinking hard to identify. That's why there's 40,000 of them, and that's why there's so few entomologists that work across, all different invertebrate groups. I think the way for that to happen, I think, is for IIAs to be adopted more locally. I think that depends on things like wildlife trusts buying into, and some of them are, some of them are expressing an interest now in making sure that their sites are better managed for invertebrates. Or it's early days for invertebrates. It's not principally an engagement tool. It's one that's much more aimed at decision makers and getting better outcomes. But as we get our IIAs developed, I like to think that there's projects that could develop around individual IIAs to showcase their invertebrates, but we haven't got an approach to that at the moment. That's a kind of future thing for when we've got this completed map network.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions relating to the triple SI designation. So I'll read those out together, and then you can kind of discuss it as a whole. So first off, someone's asked, how do IIAs relate to other conservation designations like triple SIs or national parks? And then we've had another question which follows on nicely, which says, have you been able to add any invertebrate species to triple SI site designations thus far? And if not, what are the barriers?
So obviously IIAs are not a statutory designation in the same way that triple SIs and national parks are. They keep appearing to get interest. I'm noticing, so again, with our planning work, I'm noticing more and more them being recognised in data searches from consultancies, not the work we're doing, as a useful tool to identify priorities. In terms of changing and getting more sites triple SIs, there's not a lot of appetite in Natural England at the moment for designating new sites, or NatureScot or NRW. There's very little appetite to, based on the fact that it's a very time-consuming, resource-heavy exercise. And with 30 by 30 on the ambitions around, there seems to be more of a movement towards those OECMs, which was other effective area-based conservation measures, which are other ways of securing the future land management for wildlife that doesn't involve triple SI citation. I mean, if anyone here follows Buglife, you'll see we do occasional campaigns for individual sites to be sites of special scientific interest when we think that they're worthy enough, and specifically where there's a threat around them. Swanscombe Peninsula was one of the most recently designated triple SIs, and we were part of the campaign to get that designated. We're calling for Middlewick Ranges, another in Essex at the moment, but that's doesn't look like it will happen at the moment. In terms of getting invertebrates added to their citations, it's the same thing. We've tried in a couple of instances, particularly one comes to mind in Scotland, to get an endemic species added to a III status, III citation. But there's just not a lot of resource in the organisations at the moment to make that happen. It does need that injection of funding that I think we all don't expect to come soon, unfortunately. But it is disappointing that we've got a comprehensive, well, relatively comprehensive III network, and it's not properly capturing the interest that it supports.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions left. So the next one is many important assemblages are found on PFA/coil spoil. Could these be an automatic qualifier for IA networks?
So we have in our South Wales valleys and our Thames Estuary IIAs particularly, we have an awful lot of those brownfield habitats. Almost all of the areas of PFA that have invertebrate records have found their way into our IA map because they almost inevitably have species of conservation concern. We won't automatically add a habitat. So this is worth me saying, actually. I did say you can't have an IA without invertebrates. So we'll only add areas where there are valid, verified records. But we do tend to, we are strict with that, but we also recognise the issues around invertebrate surveying. So it might be that you have a big block of habitat with loads of records of good stuff that has public access, that's next door to an identical block of habitat, and they're functionally connected, but there's no records in there. And we think it's functionally, it's supporting that population. We will include those areas without records if it's contiguous habitat supporting them. So those PFA areas, if there's areas that we've got records and they're in the publicly available data sets, then we will have them. But if there's a bit of PFA that's isolated somewhere and doesn't have adjacent records, we won't just automatically include PFA because it's a good habitat. But the areas with the most important PFA habitat do happen to be parts of our IIAs.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got one more question, which should round things up nicely. Someone's asked, what are Buglife's key long-term goals for the IA network?
The thing is, it is for IIAs to be recognised and used. I think that's fundamentally it. We want it to be something that helps. It's not that helps discussions around prioritising agri-environment schemes, about better planning decisions. We want it to be something that helps the statutory bodies with the advice they issue as well. We have had good support. So we had Welsh Government funding for the IA mapping in Wales. We've had Natural England funding for IA mapping and profiles in England. We want the buy-in of statutory agencies so that they become something that's recognised more widely. It's definitely getting there. And like I said, by the end of the year, I'd hope to have about 10 of the local environmental record centres with full complements of IA profiles and sharing them with the support and resources so they start being better decision-making tools.
Brilliant. We've actually had one more question come in. I think we have plenty of time, so I'll go ahead. It says, please can you share insights from your IA work involvement with agriculture sector and distribution of biological control agents? I can repeat it.
Please do.
Please can you share insights from your IA work involvement with the agriculture sector and distribution of biological control agents?
Yeah, the biological control agent side of thing is something that I must admit, I never stray into whatsoever. But it tends to be that our involvement with the agricultural stuff, with the IAs in mind, is all to do with getting, again, better land management, getting people hoping to move towards a situation where IAs can inform agri-environment scheme uptake. But yeah, I haven't thought about it from that angle, I have to admit.
Brilliant. So we've not got any more questions. So I'll just round things off by saying thank you again, Jamie. Especially you answered those questions really thoughtfully, so that was fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, any questions? Just email if anyone's unsure. It's jamie.robbins@buglife.org.uk, or just email our general inquiries thing, and it'll find its way to me if it's about IIAs.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.